Nobody approaches Lucian Crow's table. Nobody holds his gaze longer than it takes to set down a glass. Nobody speaks to him unless he speaks first. These aren't written rules at Meridian. They don't need to be. The men and women who work the floor at Chicago's most exclusive supper club learn them the same way you learn not to touch a hot stove, once, and with consequences that don't require repeating. Lucian Crow arrives every Tuesday and Thursday at 8 o'clock precisely, dark suit, no tie. A glass of Barolo he never finishes, and eyes that have watched men make their last mistakes without blinking once. On a Thursday in February, his 8-year-old niece started choking on a piece of sourdough bread. Every server on the floor froze. The head waiter took an actual step backward. The sommelier found something urgent to examine near the wine rack, 8 feet away, his back turned. 6 of Lucian's men sat with their hands on the table and did not move. Fern Dacey had been working at Meridian for 4 days. She didn't freeze. She set her tray on the nearest surface, crossed the dining room in 6 steps, got behind the child, and performed the Heimlich maneuver the way her high school health teacher had taught her 12 years ago. Firm, deliberate, no wasted motion. The bread dislodged. The little girl gasped and then burst into tears, and Fern pulled her in and held her and said, right there, in front of Lucian Crow and every man at his table, "You're okay, you're okay, I've got you, just breathe." The silence that followed was the kind that fills a room from floor to ceiling and presses on your ears. Because nobody puts their hands on anyone at Lucian Crow's table without permission. Because this girl, this nobody in a black uniform who had been on the floor for 4 shifts and did not yet know enough to be afraid, had just done it anyway. And she wasn't shaking. She wasn't apologizing. She was holding a crying 8-year-old and rubbing her back and waiting for the breathing to even out. She didn't even look up at him. To understand why Fern Dacey's hands didn't shake, you have to understand where she came from. You have to understand what she'd already survived before she ever walked into Meridian. Fern grew up in Jasper, Indiana, population 11,000 and falling, a mill town that hadn't had a functioning mill in 20 years. She was raised by her mother Joanne in a yellow house on Clement Street with a porch that tilted to the left and a furnace that gave out every January without fail. Her father had been there until Fern was 12, and then one morning he wasn't, and neither was the checking account, and neither was any explanation. Joanne Dacey worked at the county hospital as a nursing aide for 19 years. She remembered every patient's name. She remembered their birthdays. She worked doubles and took her breaks standing at the window, watching the parking lot, just to have 30 seconds alone. She was diagnosed with stage 3 ovarian cancer the year Fern turned 20. Fern had been 2 semesters into a biology degree at Indiana State. She dropped it without telling her academic advisor, packed what fit into a single duffel bag, and took a Greyhound to Chicago where a cousin had mentioned there was work. She found 2 jobs within a week. Morning shifts at a 24-hour diner near Wacker Drive, evenings wherever she could get them. Meridian had been luck. A friend of a friend who'd quit without notice and put Fern's name in with the manager. The pay was triple what she'd made anywhere. The clientele tipped in hundreds. All she had to do was be invisible. She was very good at her job. She was also very good at being invisible. She'd been practicing since she was 12. She lived in a studio apartment in Logan Square, 3rd floor, window that faced a brick wall, a fold-out couch her cousin had left behind, a hot plate, a shower head that dribbled more than it flowed. She set her alarm for 4:30 every morning and worked the diner until 11, slept 2 hours if she was lucky and hit the Meridian floor by 6, home by midnight, alarm at 4:30, repeat. She sent $600 to Jasper every month, straight to the oncology billing department. It covered roughly 1/3 of what her mother owed. She didn't think about the rest. Thinking about the rest was a luxury she hadn't been able to afford since she was old enough to understand what debt meant. She wore her grandmother's watch, a small silver thing with a scratched face, because it was the last object she hadn't sold. She ate peanut butter crackers in the service corridor between the kitchen and the private dining rooms on her breaks, standing because there was nowhere to sit. She had 3 pairs of work shoes she rotated so the soles would last. The left shoe of the middle pair had a crack she'd sealed with medical tape. She'd learned to pack fast, to sleep light, to read a room in the time it took to cross it, who was angry, who was performing, who was about to make it someone else's problem. She'd learned these things because she had no other option. Survival teaches efficiently when the stakes are high enough. And so when the little girl started choking and every trained adult on that floor stood still, Fern Dacey's body simply moved. No thought, no calculation, just a child who couldn't breathe and a pair of hands that knew exactly what to do. She found out whose niece she'd saved only after it was already done. Lucian Crow had not moved during any of it. He'd sat absolutely still, which was actually more unnerving than movement, the particular stillness of a man running numbers, waiting for the calculation to finish. His second, a man named Casper Toll who'd been with him for 11 years, had reached inside his jacket on reflex. Lucian had raised 2 fingers without taking his eyes off Fern. The hand came back out. When the little girl had calmed down enough to breathe steadily, Fern had looked up. She'd looked directly at Lucian Crow. Nobody did that, not on purpose, not by accident. Everyone who worked at Meridian knew where to fix their gaze. The table, the glass, the middle distance. You learned not to register his face. Fern didn't know that yet. She was still 4 days in. She held his gaze for 3 full seconds. Not in challenge, not in fear, just directly. The way you look at someone when you need to be certain they understand what just happened. He understood. "What's your name?" he said. His voice was lower than she'd expected, controlled the way a river is controlled by its banks. Not quiet, but bounded. "Fern Dacey, I've been working here 4 days. "I know." He'd noticed her before Thursday. Lucian noticed everyone who entered his radius. Efficient, quiet, competent. He hadn't thought much beyond that until now. You didn't hesitate. Fern looked at the little girl, who had his same dark coloring and was hiccuping softly into a glass of water. "She's a kid," Fern said simply. He said nothing. She went back to her section. But walking to the L stop that night, with her collar turned up against the February cold, she couldn't stop thinking about the way he'd looked at her afterward. Not like a threat. Not like a curiosity. Like she'd solved a problem he hadn't known he was trying to work out. He came back the next Tuesday, and the Thursday after, and without any formal reassignment, Fern became the server who worked his table. The head waiter, a tall, careful man named Greer who had been at Meridian for 9 years, told her it was a compliment. His eyes said something different. They said, "Be careful." The little girl, Blythe, Lucian's niece, came back twice more. Always unexpected, always because her mother had dropped her with her brother while handling something. Blythe was 8 and had decided, with the total certainty of an 8-year-old, that Fern was her person. She asked for the breadbasket immediately upon sitting down. She told Fern about school, about her teacher, about the class hamster, whose name she felt strongly should be changed from Biscuit to something more dignified. She was campaigning for Reginald. Lucian watched these conversations the way he watched everything, from a controlled distance, collecting. He started asking Fern questions, small ones at first. Where she was from. How long she'd been in the city. Whether she'd eaten, which was a strange question until she realized he'd seen the crackers in the service corridor 2 nights running and filed it away. She answered him the way she answered everything, directly, without performance. No softening, no expansion. She was from Indiana, 3 months in Chicago, and yes, she'd eaten, which wasn't entirely true, but she'd learned long ago not to let anyone see the exact dimensions of how thin the ice was beneath her. He saw through it anyway. She could tell by the way he stopped asking and left an envelope on the table when he left one Tuesday. $600. No note. She almost left it there. She took it home and stared at it for 20 minutes and then put $500 in the envelope going to Jasper and kept $100 for groceries. She told herself it wasn't charity. She told herself it was a tip. She didn't fully believe herself. On a Thursday in late March, she was wiping down tables in the private dining room off the main hall when she heard voices through the connecting door. She should have moved away, should have taken her cart and disappeared, the way she'd trained herself to disappear for years. She heard her name. The Dacey girl. The one that works his floor. She went still. She's got access. Every Tuesday, every Thursday, she knows his patterns when the kid comes. A pause, the sound of something being poured. What are you offering? 30,000, and we clear whatever she owes in Indiana, medical bills. The floor dropped out from under her. They knew about her mother. They knew about Jasper, about the 600 a month, about the oncology billing department. She didn't know how, and it didn't matter. What mattered was that someone, people who wanted to move against Lucian, had decided she was the easiest entry point. On paper, they weren't wrong. She needed the money. She had access. She had no loyalty to anyone at that table. Except she'd held Blythe while the girl cried and said, "You're okay, I've got you." And she knew the precise difference between someone who has you and someone who doesn't. A man was waiting outside her building the next morning. He handed her a manila envelope without speaking. Inside, a bank statement in her mother's name showing a zero balance on a debt that had been $84,000. And a phone number, 3 days, someone had written in pencil, "Just confirm his schedule. Once, you'll never hear from us again." She sat on the steps of her building in the cold and held that envelope. Thought about Joanne on Clement Street, watching daytime television with a heating pad, stopped opening the bills because the numbers had become incomprehensible. Thought about the watch on her wrist. Thought about 3-second windows and whether you step through them or let them close. Then she made the call she'd been making, in one form or another, since she was 12, the hard one, the one that cost something. She went to Meridian at 10 in the morning, when the dining room was dark and the chairs were still on the tables. Greer tried to stop her. She walked past him. Casper Toll stepped into the hallway when he heard her on the stairs. She looked at him and said, "I need to see him now. It's about Blythe." The name worked. Lucian's office was dark wood and low light and windows that looked out over Chicago's rooftops. He was on a call when she entered. He ended it without looking away from her. She put the manila envelope on his desk. "Someone approached me last night. They want his schedule. When you're here, when Blythe comes. They offered to clear my mother's debt." She held his gaze steady. "I didn't take it." He didn't move, didn't reach for the envelope, didn't call for Casper or anyone else. He just watched her the way he'd been watching her since Thursday. That dark, precise, unreadable attention that felt like being measured against something she couldn't see. "Why didn't you?" Not a question, a requirement for truth. Fern thought about saying something strategic, something that would make her sound calculated, self-interested, impossible to manipulate. Something that didn't leave her exposed. She told him the truth instead. She'd been living too long with the cost of easier answers. "Because your niece cried on my shoulder and called me nice." She paused. "I know what it feels like when someone actually shows up for you. I'm not willing to be the person who doesn't." The silence expanded. Outside, the city went on without them. Lucian stood and came around the desk, measured, no wasted motion, and stopped close enough that she had to hold herself very steady not to step back. "You've made yourself a problem for people who don't resolve problems cleanly." His voice was the same low, controlled register, but something in it had changed. Like a combination lock clicking into alignment. "You understand that." "I figured. We'll need to find where the leak is. Someone in my organization gave them your mother's billing information." He walked back to his desk, picked up his phone, began quietly setting things in motion. "You'll stay somewhere secure while we work it out." She stood in the middle of his office and understood, with complete clarity, that she had crossed a line she could not uncross, that the invisible girl in the black uniform was no longer invisible, that Lucian Crow had just quietly reclassified her into something more significant than efficient and quiet, and that she was not afraid of it. She was, for the first time in years, something close to seen. She didn't move into a penthouse. That wasn't what happened. Lucian arranged for her to stay in a building his organization owned in River North. A clean apartment, nothing extravagant, security on the door. He told her what it was, a liability arrangement. Someone had found a way into his operation through her, and until that someone was identified, she was a loose end that needed managing. She told him she understood she did. What she hadn't anticipated was sleeping 8 hours for the first time since Jasper. No sirens through thin walls, no shouting from next door, no fear of finding something taped to the door in the morning. She woke up disoriented, blinking at an unfamiliar ceiling, because her body had calibrated to deprivation for so long that its absence read as a mistake. Lucian sent a car for her each evening. He didn't eat with her, he worked, but he was there, at the corner booth or in his office above the floor, and somewhere in the part of her that had been running survival calculations since age 12, that registered as steady, predictable, safe, in the specific way that only consistent things are safe. They talked, eventually, carefully at first. He asked about her mother, not pity, just facts. She gave them, the diagnosis, the treatment schedule, the monthly math. He listened the way he listened to everything, with the focus of a man who does not let things pass by him unregistered. One evening, late, while she was closing her section, and he was finishing something at the bar, she asked him whether he'd always run things this quietly. He looked up. What way? Quietly, she said. You're not what I expected. What did you expect? She considered honestly. Someone who needed to be seen, louder, more visible. Something moved across his face she hadn't seen before. Not softness, Lucian Crow wasn't soft, but a momentary absence of the armor, a window, open for just a moment. I was visible once, loud. I ran this from the front. He set down his glass. It costs more than it earns. She thought about 12-year-old Fern learning to take up less space on purpose. Yeah, she said quietly. I know exactly what you mean. He looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up his glass again. But it was the realest thing he'd said to her. And she carried it home that night like something worth protecting. If you've been listening to this, and your chest has been getting tighter, you already understand what's happening between these two people. Two people who both learned to make themselves smaller just to survive, and neither of them knows yet what it's going to mean that they've found each other. Subscribe to Sadie's Romance Library right now, turn on notifications, because what Fern figures out next is the thing that changes everything for both of them. The inside source took 3 weeks to surface. Lucian's people were looking in the expected places. Financials, communications, loyalty histories. They were looking at men with access and motive. Fern was looking at something smaller. She went back to work at Meridian, back to the black uniform and the service corridor and the quiet movement through the dining room. But now she was listening the way she'd always listened, for what was off rhythm, for who was performing, for the thing that didn't fit the pattern of itself. She found it on the second week, not a person at first, a pattern. The private Walcott room was booked every other Friday under the same company name, and the same server had handled it every time. A man named Dov Reese, 4 years on the floor, who worked the private dining section and who was on shift every night Blythe had ever come in. He handled the room assignments. He saw the floor plan before anyone else. He would have known when Lucian's sister called ahead to arrange a seat for the child, and he would have known Fern's section, and he would have known where to find her building address in the employee files. She didn't go to Casper. She went directly to Lucian. She sat across from him in his office at 11 in the morning and laid it out in order. The booking pattern, the server match, the access Dov had to everything they'd used, her mother's billing records, the schedule, the knowledge of Blythe's visits. She'd written it on a notepad in her small, precise handwriting, the same handwriting she used to log drink orders. Lucian read it twice. Then he looked at her. You could have used this as leverage, he said, to negotiate something for yourself. I don't operate that way. Most people do. Most people are afraid, she said. I was afraid too. I just decided it wasn't useful anymore. He was quiet for a long moment. And in that quiet, something shifted, the way a room changes when someone finally opens a window that's been painted shut for years. She'd stopped being a calculation to him. He could feel it settling, the difference between a variable and a fixed point. Dov Reese was gone from the schedule within 48 hours. What came after, Fern didn't ask about and wasn't told. What she knew was that the Walcott room's Friday bookings stopped, and that the pressure from whoever had approached her evaporated the way threats do when the pressure behind them has been removed, quietly and without ceremony. 6 months after the Thursday with the sourdough bread, Fern Dacey was still working at Meridian. She'd run the calculation a dozen times, tried to find the version of events where the sensible thing was to take the security deposit. Lucian had quietly put in her account, quit the job, go back to being invisible somewhere less complicated. She couldn't make the math resolve, not because of him, primarily because of Blythe, who had started requesting Fern's section specifically, and who had successfully renamed the class Hamster Reginald, and who told Fern things she didn't tell the adults in her regular life, in the specific way children confide in the person they've decided is safe. Because of Greer, who'd stopped watching her with the eyes of someone expecting disaster and had started treating her like someone worth knowing. Because she'd stopped dreading Tuesdays and Thursdays, and dreading things had been her default mode for so long that its absence felt significant, worth holding on to. Lucian had cleared her mother's debt. He'd done it without asking first, which made her furious, and she'd told him so, which had made him go absolutely still in the precise way he went still when something genuinely surprised him. Nobody told Lucian Crow they were angry with him. He'd looked at her for a long moment and said, "It wasn't charity. You saved something I can't replace." The math is straightforward, she'd wanted to argue. She'd seen he wasn't wrong. She'd said, "Next time, ask." He'd said, "There won't be a next time." She'd said, "Ask anyway." The almost smile had appeared, the slight shift at the corner of his mouth she'd learned to recognize, the one that only happened when something caught him genuinely off guard. The floor staff called her Fern now, not the new girl. Casper Toll had held a door open for her without being asked, which Greer had told her, in the understated way Greer communicated everything, was not a small thing. One evening as she was closing her section, Lucian came down from his office and sat, not at his corner booth, at the table in her section, her table. He had his Barolo, he didn't have his men. She brought him the bread basket without being asked. He didn't knock it over. "You stayed," he said, when the room had emptied and the last of the staff had cleared out. "I stayed." He looked at his glass, then at her. "I've been thinking about why." She sat down across from him. It wasn't something servers did at Meridian, but that category hadn't organized this situation for a while. "Blythe renamed the hamster," she said. "I needed to see how it played out." The almost smile made it all the way. She watched it happen and felt something shift in her chest. Not dramatic, not sudden, just a quiet settling into place, like furniture moved to where it was always meant to be. He reached across the table and picked up her hand gently. Just her fingers, briefly. He looked at the small silver watch with its scratched face. Her grandmother's watch. The last thing. He held it the way he held things that mattered to him, with the full weight of his attention. "You've been surviving your whole life," he said. She met his eyes. "Yeah. That's done now." It wasn't a command. It was a fact about something that had already happened. "Whatever you need." Fern Dacey looked at the man across the table. Not the crime lord. Not the figure that organized every room he entered around the fact of his presence. Just the version of him she'd been assembling piece by piece for 6 months. The man who went absolutely still when his niece couldn't breathe. Who left $600 without a note. Who said it costs more than it earns about the life he'd built before he knew better. Who had sat down on the wrong side of his own restaurant just to be in her section for once. She turned her hand over and held his. "I know," she said. Outside, Chicago moved through another night, all its lights burning against the February dark, all its people surviving the specific cold of a city that doesn't slow down for anyone. Inside Meridian, in the corner of a room that had been enemy territory once, 2 people who had spent their lives making themselves useful through their silence, sat across from each other and didn't need to say anything more. She wasn't invisible anymore. She wasn't sure yet what she would be instead. But for the first time since Clement Street, since the watch, since 12 years old, and a duffel bag and a Greyhound going north, she wasn't figuring it out alone. "Now I want to hear from you. Which moment hit you hardest?" Was it when Fern walked straight to that choking child, while every adult on the floor stepped back? Was it when she put that envelope on his desk, instead of cashing in on what it offered? Or was it that final scene, two people who had both spent years making themselves smaller, finally sitting across from each other with nothing left to hide? Tell me in the comments. And if you want more stories about people who step forward when everyone else falls back, subscribe to Sadie's Romance Library and turn on notifications. There's always another story, and I'll be here to tell it.